Hello, everyone. I'm Bishop Megan Rohrer of the Sierra Pacific Synod, and I have a special guest with me today. Special guest, will you introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. My name is Dale Poland. I am an ordained Lutheran pastor and also a hospice chaplain and a grief counselor.
We're going to talk a little bit about grief today. And so if you don't want to talk about grief today because you don't have space for it, you can listen a different day. But welcome to the people who are here and who are listening and who are interested. Would you tell people about some of the intersections that you embody?
As a chaplain and as a grief counselor, I deal, a hospice chaplain, I deal with a lot of death and dying and the grief that comes after loss. I've certainly had my own losses in my life that help inform my understanding of grief and loss, but then also working with lots of people who have experienced losses in their life and trying to provide support to them, trying to help them to understand what it is that they're going through, how normal grief is, as difficult as it is. It's also very normal. It's something that we all experience throughout our lives, myself included. So very often when I'm doing grief counseling, I see a lot of myself in the clients that I'm working with, and I often identify with a lot of what they're experiencing and going through, because again, grief is a very normal human experience.
And how do you think working with death and with grief so much changes or shapes your faith?
Wow, that's a good question. So I think working with death and dying and being around the dying has really strengthened my faith and reinforced my faith. I was with a woman today who is actively dying, and her family was there with her and around the bed. And they talked about their faith, and they talked about how their faith was comforting them and strengthening them in this time. And they talked about their mom's faith and how she had lived a life of service to God and to her neighbors, and how that faith was something that was embracing her now as she was entering this last phase of her life. And certainly, being around death and dying as much as I am, it reminds me of my own mortality. It pushes me to reflect upon my mortality in a way that I probably wouldn't otherwise, and to think about it, and to draw on my own faith and my own belief system around God's presence in my life now, and what happens after death, and reassuring me of those promises of life after death. And so people often ask me, how can you be a hospice chaplain? How can you be around death and dying as much as you are? And for me, it's a very natural thing. And it's also a very spiritual thing. It's a very sacred space, I believe, to be with people at the end of life. And also people who are grieving. It's a very sacred space. I feel God's presence when I'm doing the work that I do.
And I have served a bit as a chaplain for the San Francisco Police Department, doing kind of crisis chaplaincy work in the community, which has mostly meant that when there was a large number of people who had died, or people died tragically or suddenly, or if it was a child, or during a seasonal holiday where first responders wondered if the grief would feel harder or different. I might get a call to go to someone's house and care for them during the time that kind of the police were on scene and providing care and support for people. And that included helping to train lots of different community chaplains for that work and providing chaplaincy support to the medical examiners in San Francisco who serve in 13-hour shifts and sleep at the medical examiner's office while caring for folk who are in grief and trying to care for those who have passed away. And that felt to me like it was a very special kind of grief calling, that grief that is within the first 72 hours of an emergency or a disaster, particularly in a sudden and tragic death, feels like a different thing some days than people who might be able to know that their death is coming, particularly if they're in hospice care where there might be a time of transition that's sort of marked by the medical community. And I wonder if in your grief work, you see, are there differences for people who have a little bit of knowledge that death might be coming and what grief is like for them and for their family?
Yeah, I think what you're describing in the work that you did is what I would call traumatic loss or traumatic grief, that very sudden, unexpected loss. And that can look very different, as you said. It can look very different than the grief that someone might feel when they know that the death is coming. They've had time to prepare. They've experienced some anticipatory grief prior to the death. They've had some closure prior to the death. That type of grief definitely is different. But as I tell every one of my clients, every person grieves differently. No two people grieve exactly the same way. And I've experienced people who have had a loved one on hospice for a year and have watched their loved one slowly decline over that year. And yet when they take their final breath to that loved one, it is a traumatic experience. It is as if that person was hit by a bus and just suddenly died, as if they had no preparation, no warning whatsoever. And so that's why I always say grief is very individualized. You can't necessarily make assumptions about how someone's going to respond or how somebody's going to grieve a particular type of loss. There are dozens of different factors that play into why we grieve the way we do and why we respond the way we do. It's interesting to me. You can take two people in a same family, two siblings who lose a parent, and they can grieve in very different ways because they're two very different people. And there are different factors that are affecting each of them in their grief process. And that kind of brings me to the topic of grief during this pandemic, during the last 2 years, and how this pandemic that we've lived through, how that has affected people who were grieving or are grieving. And I can tell you, both from my own experience and also from the research that's just now beginning to come out, the incredible impact that the pandemic had on people who were grieving. I think it was around March 20th, 2020, when everything kind of shut down. And the very next day, my phone started ringing, and it did not stop ringing until January 2022. I mean, people were just, particularly in the first couple of months, they were just so overwhelmed. They didn't know what end was up, and needing support and experiencing depression and anxiety and trauma and grief like they had never experienced before. The complicated, what we call complicated grief, which typically only occurs for about 10 to 15% of people who experience a loss. That number shot up significantly during the pandemic, because you had all these other factors that were complicating people's grief process and making it much harder for them to grieve. So there's just so many different factors that play into how a person is going to grieve and how they're going to respond to the death of a loved one, that sometimes it's hard to anticipate. It's hard to characterize what it's going to be until you're actually in it.
Well, and it has felt to me like some of the ways that COVID has complicated things is particularly for those who experience changes in the ways that they normally ritualized grief. Like people who used to be able to have large gatherings in order to share their grief, who couldn't have gatherings at all for a certain period of time, or had to have funerals outside in graveyards, which was not their particular faith tradition, or people who really went deep into the denial aspect because they couldn't go to a funeral and they couldn't confirm that someone had died, or the difficulty of, you used to be able to go to the hospital and a person at the hospital would tell you someone had died. And you could only get a phone call because you couldn't get someone, right? Just that you couldn't, there was a period of time you couldn't bring food to people, and eating and being together was kind of a part of our rituals. And so there were ways in which we had to reinvent how to respond to grief during some of the deep parts of this that I think some people still haven't recovered from, because they are trying to figure out, well, when is it safe for that funeral we should have done 2 years ago?
Absolutely. And there's a number of different factors that you identified that I think are significant. Number one, so many people during the pandemic couldn't be with their loved ones when they were dying. I think we all kind of envision that when our loved one is dying, that we're going to be there. We're going to be there to hold their hand. We're going to be there to comfort them. We're going to be there to let them know that they're not alone. And for so many people during the pandemic, they couldn't be with their loved one. And that separation was so hard. It was hard in the moment, but is also hard now in their grief process, that they were not able to be there at that moment as they wanted to be. Another aspect, as you said, is the importance of rituals around death and dying, and how important community is around death and dying. When my father died 20 years ago, he was part of a small community, and he was an integral part of the community. And so when he died, the church was literally overflowing with people who came to bear witness to his life and to grieve with us, his family. And I remember at that time feeling so much support and so much comfort with all those people being there with me in my grief. For those who died during COVID, many of them were denied that opportunity to be with their community, to be with their loved ones, to feel that support around them. And that is a tremendous loss for a lot of people who are grieving. So I think you're absolutely right. There are so many different factors. I've since ended it, but for about a year, a little over a year, I did a grief support group by Zoom for people whose loved one died specifically from COVID-19. And one of the things that was really interesting to me in that group was how much anger there was in the group. And I mean, anger is a normal part of the grief process, but in that particular group of people, there was so much anger for so many different reasons. But one of them was this idea of preventability. My loved one didn't have to die. My loved one, there are so many things that could have been done to have protected my loved one, but they weren't done, and now my loved one has died. And so that the anger and the rage that they felt around that was just so strong, and it's going to take them a long time to work through that and to be able to come to a place where they can find some peace around that. I think there's a lot of factors that played into complicating people's grief process during this pandemic, for sure.
I feel like there's a component too that we haven't yet sifted about how big it is, right? Today, for those of you watching on the recording, today is April 21st of 2022. And according to Johns Hopkins, 6.21 million people have died from COVID in the world, and 989,000 have died from COVID here in the United States, approaching 1 million deaths. And normally when there is an event where there is just a gigantic number of deaths like that, we try to find a way to have communal art, right? Whether it's, World War II statues and statues for people we lost in the war, or I think of like the AIDS quilt being one of those ways that we have expressed that. And I feel like we haven't really found that communal way of expressing our grief yet, but I hope that we'll keep searching for it. I don't know. Do you have thoughts about just the enormity of how we can manage to compartmentalize all of this?
It's huge, and we are going to be living with the ramifications of this for many years to come, for sure. But one of the things that you brought up that I think is significant when we talk about the pandemic is what we call disenfranchised grief. Disenfranchised grief is grief that someone feels where they don't feel supported, or they don't feel like other people understand their loss, or they don't feel like they can be public or open about their loss. And so many people who lost a loved one to COVID-19 feel disenfranchised by their loss for a number of reasons. For some, it's because the number is so large, right? 980,000 people died of COVID. Their loved one is just one of 980,000. And so oftentimes they can feel disenfranchised because they feel like, well, their loved one is just a statistic, is just a number. It doesn't mean anything. So many people have died that they feel like their loved one has been lost in the enormity of it all. And so they feel like people don't want to talk about it, don't want to hear about it. And so they feel disenfranchised by it. They feel like they have to hold it in. And then you have people whose loved one died of something else during the pandemic. So they died of heart disease, or they died of cancer during the pandemic. For a long time, all people wanted to talk about was COVID-19 deaths. And so people who died from something else felt disenfranchised, felt like their loss was not important, or their loss was not as significant. And so again, they felt like they had to kind of hold it in, or they didn't feel as comfortable talking about it or sharing it. And so I think this disenfranchised grief is something that a lot of people are going to carry for quite some time. And it's going to take them time before they feel comfortable, or before they feel ready to really open up about it and really talk about it and feel like they have the support that they need. I talked earlier about, all these different factors that impact our grief process. But one of those factors is what type of support we have around us. And I often say it's not about the number of people we have around us, but the type of people that we have around us. You can have 100 people around you, but if those 100 people are not comfortable with your grief and are not able to allow you to express your grief in the way that you need to express it, then they're not going to be helpful to you. But if you have one person, sometimes it's just one person who will just sit with you and will validate you and will normalize your experience and will listen to you and give you the space to just let it out. If you just have one person, that's oftentimes all you need in order to begin to heal in the grief.
Well, as you mentioned, kind of other ways that people have been dying, at least in San Francisco, and I think in other parts of the country, addiction deaths and overdose deaths are at an all-time high. In San Francisco, approaching the number of deaths at the beginning of the AIDS epidemic, and that with drugs like Narcan that can help sort of resurrect people. And I think of these kind of deaths, and sometimes there's an additional maybe corner to grief that is dealing with the fact that there's some relief sometimes, that if you've spent a lot of your life wondering if someone's going to die from risky behaviors, if they do die from risky behaviors, there can be a part of your emotions, not all of it, but part of it that feels relieved that you don't have to worry about it into the future, or that this person might have peace now, or a space away from the addiction that they carried, if you believe in an afterlife where you're released from those things. And trying to give yourself permission to feel all the kaleidoscope of feelings that happen in the midst of grief, I find is a really important way to sort of sit with people as they're going through something hard like addiction, but also like to just embrace sort of the ways that responding to a death that might have a component that involves someone participating in the risk that they experienced, but also has other communal components of difficulty and political components, and ways that as a society we have also participated in some of those deaths. It can be a very complicated way to sit with grief, but very helpful for people to be able to name out loud all the varieties of ways that they're feeling when grief comes to them.
Mm-hmm.
And addiction seems to be one that really raises up a lot of those kaleidoscopes of feelings. But the truth is that even dying in your sleep can bring you all those kaleidoscope of feelings, given the right combination of factors, right?
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I often tell people, after the death of a loved one, oftentimes we just have to do whatever we can do to cope, to get by from day to day. And who am I to judge somebody else on how they are having to cope? Now, certainly there are some ways of coping that are healthier than other ways of coping. But at the same time, if you're talking about addictive behavior, if that's what you need today just to get through today, okay, we'll look at it later. Later on, when you're in a different place, maybe we can look at it and say, is this helping you? Is this hurting you? But right now, if it's getting you through till tomorrow, then that's what you need to do. I think one of the things that makes grief so difficult is what many people call, and I call, the emotional roller coaster that is grief. That just the unpredictableness of grief. You never know from day to day, from hour to hour, from moment to moment, how the grief is going to impact you, and when the grief is going to be triggered, and when it's triggered, how it's going to affect you. You can be at work and you can be perfectly fine, and then somebody makes a comment that triggers your grief, and all of a sudden it just comes pouring out. And trying to cope with that and trying to navigate that and trying to deal with that is so difficult. As a grief counselor, I often see people struggling because they want to try to control their grief. They want to kind of put it into a box where they feel comfortable with it, and they feel like they have some control over it. But it's not possible. It's like trying to cage a tiger. You're just gonna wear yourself out trying to control it. And so a lot of my work as a grief counselor is to help people to kind of relax into it as best they can and allow themselves to feel whatever it is they need to feel, and to trust that they will be okay. That if they allow themselves to go on that roller coaster and to go up and down and to feel those emotions that come up, that it can be okay, that they will be okay, that they don't have to control it, that they can just move into it and trust that they'll be okay.
I like that way of talking about it, because then it opens up space to talk about even the untalkaboutable things, if and that's not even a word, but I think you know what I mean in talking about grief, because I mean, you kind of hinted towards it with talking about harm reduction, like do the thing that's going to get you through to tomorrow so that you can make a healthier choice tomorrow. If that's the only choice that's going to get you there. And I think that's where, like, I'll just name it, suicide is a sticky wicket in the midst of grief. It's hard when a loved one dies from suicide to try to figure out how to have grief, because people have shame and fear. They're not certain if they should talk about it with other people or if it should stay private. And I can't make any of those decisions for you, but I just want to name it as one of the really hard things to step through in grief. But I think also is the just to name out loud that thinking about what if I joined this person in death is a thought people have in grief. And sometimes they're afraid to say it out loud, because if you say it out loud, maybe someone will think you mean it in a different way, or maybe you do mean it entirely in the moment that you say it. And someone who is caring for you in a grief situation, just like you said, is going to let you say it, is going to know that any thought or comment is normal, and wanting to be with someone you love so dearly, of course you want to be with them. Acting on it is a more problematic and more difficult thing. But sitting with someone who can guide you in your grief, or who can be in a grief support group with you, can make sure that you are not alone stuck in that thought, but that you do get to the next spot on the roller coaster of how it feels next, right? Because on the other side of wanting to join someone is the anger that you can't, or that they're not still here, right? And so finding out what's on the other side of a lot of those feelings that you can really get stuck in is really important. And so I just wanted to name that, because I think it's one of the hard things that people might have fear or shame about and think they can't talk to a pastor about, or they can't talk to a therapist about, or to a chaplain, or right. But you can talk about it, make it really clear if you mean it, if you're serious about it and you want to act on it, or if it's just, or what the scope of that feeling is. But you can talk about it.
Absolutely. And we were talking earlier about disenfranchised grief. Death by suicide is a huge disenfranchised loss. And people don't feel comfortable being able to talk about that. They feel like they won't be validated. They won't be supported if they, admit, or if they acknowledge that their loved one took their life, or if they're thinking about taking their life, joining their loved one. I think as a grief counselor, I'm always encouraging people, urging people to talk, to say what it is that they're really thinking and feeling. And the reason is because I think there's healing in that. There's healing in being able to name what you're feeling and what you're thinking. That somehow when we hold it in, it has this power over us. But as soon as we speak it, as soon as we give it a name, it's like popping a balloon. All the air begins to drain out of it, and it's not as it doesn't have the same hold on us as it did before. So when I acknowledge to somebody, hey, I'm thinking about ending my life, or I am so distraught, or I feel so alone, or I feel so lost that I can't even imagine waking up tomorrow morning. just being able to verbalize that to somebody else and have somebody else acknowledge that that's how you feel. Not try to fix you, not try to change you, but just say, I get it. I get that this is how you're feeling. I hear you. I see you. I acknowledge that this is what you're feeling. Oftentimes, that's all someone needs to begin to kind of move it, begin to process it and move to a different place. But as long as we hold it inside, as long as we kind of keep it a secret inside of us, that's when it gets dangerous, I think.
A number of our faith leaders in the Sierra Pacific Synod have talked about how grueling it has felt to be leading so many funerals. And there was one congregation that had 25 funerals booked in a 2-week period, and none of them from COVID. Just if the median age in a congregation is 50 or 70 or higher, it's just a part of kind of pastoral life. And I wonder, for those pastors who are feeling weary and exhausted and tired, if you can share some of the ways that you try to develop your own resiliency, or some of the ways that you work to be less burnt out than you are on other days when it's closer to the brim. Like, what has helped you with your longevity in being someone who sits near grief?
Yeah, I'd be curious to hear that as well. Yeah.
For me, it's trying to just put self-care wherever I can, because you never know when the next emergency is going to be. Or it's finding other people who have encountered death quite a bit and grief quite a bit, and being able to talk to people who can speak frankly about it and grisly about it. First responders are those kind of people for me, like firefighters can talk about death in a way that is sometimes gallows humor, and is other times just very frank about how to take life as sweetly as you can in every moment that you can. But I don't take enough vacations and get enough rest, so it's definitely one of those things I also try to preach to myself as often as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, whether we're talking about grief counselors, we're talking about pastors, I think one of the commonalities between them is that most pastors and most counselors are empaths, right? They're very good at empathizing with others. And to empathize is, as I often say, empathizing is stepping into someone else's shoes, stepping into somebody else's world, and seeing the world through their eyes, and feeling the world through their experience. And it's crucial as a pastor or a counselor to be able to do that. But it's also critical that when that visit is over, or when that time is over, that you as the pastor, or you as the counselor, are able to step back out of that world again, and to recognize that that's not my world, that's someone else's world. So many pastors and so many counselors that I see that experience burnout, it's because they've empathized so much with other people that they've gotten lost in other people's pain, and they've gotten lost in other people's grief, and they can no longer separate themselves from that. So I think a big part of self-care is having really healthy boundaries, and being able to know, okay, it's the end of the day, and now I'm going home, and I'm not going to think about my day, and I'm not going to think about all the pain and all the sadness that I've been dealing with today, but I'm going to go play with my dog, as Crystal said, or I'm going to spend time with my partner, or I'm going to go for a long walk, or I'm going to read a book or watch TV or go on vacation, or whatever I need to do, go to the gym and work out, whatever I need to do to take care of myself. and be able to leave other people's pain and grief at the doorstep, I think is really, really critical.
Yeah, that's a big part of what I would do. For me, wearing a uniform was very helpful. That when I do very tragic things, I wear a very particular uniform, and then I take that particular uniform off, and then I don't do those things. And like, but Crystal Larson Stewart, who is a hospital staff chaplain in our synod, has some great ideas talking about self-care being vital, taking breaks between hard visits.
Mm-hmm.
Intentional time with dogs. That's a good one. Finding a community church. And I just think anything, whatever it is that's self-care for you is self-care for you, right? It's very
Absolutely.
similar to what grief care is for people. Whatever grief care is for you is grief care for you. And just finding ways to kind of like care for yourself in the midst of how rough and tumbly this world is, I think is really important. I would also add to that, because a lot of my experiences with things that often would make the news because there were police cars there, that turning off the TV was always a part of the advice. Like, if what is stirring up your grief is something that makes the papers, don't read the papers, or don't go on Facebook, or don't encounter the news. And I think that's particularly true it can be true for anything, right? Because someone can die from cancer, and tomorrow on the news they can have a story on cancer that's going to kind of gurgle it all up for you. And so, like, think about the things that are visually stirring things up for you. Even write it down. If you have a particularly hard day, what are the things you saw at the beginning of your hard day, or the weather, or just the more you can try to fit together some of the pieces. Because what I discovered from doing a lot of grief work is that I could get really sad and not know why for the day. But if I figured out, oh, someone wore that coat at that thing I did that was hard, or there's a particular season, that always would trigger me to know when I needed care for myself, or to know more about what was happening.
Absolutely. And I think, in terms of self-care, again, everybody is different, and what every person needs is different. So for example, I am a very strong introvert. And so while I love the work that I do, it takes a lot out of me. By the end of the day, very often I have very little left in my tank when I get home. And so very often what ends up happening is my partner and I come together, we have dinner together, we share our day, we connect with each other, but then we kind of go our separate ways, because he knows that I need some space. I need some time to recharge and kind of look inward for a while. And so he kind of gives me that space to be able to do that. And so, every person is different. You just have to kind of figure out what you need in order to recharge at the end of a day, or the end of a week, or a month, whatever it happens to be.
Yeah, kid cuddles are always fun at our house.
Absolutely.
Impromptu song singing competitions, always helpful. Or like even just knowing you have a favorite kind of movie, right? That one go-to movie that's going to help you through the other side of whatever the feeling is, whether it's the one that makes you cry it all out, or the one that helps you put it all back together, or laugh through whatever is happening. There are some fun somatic ways to kind of decrease grief and trauma pains. There's studies that say just turning the back of your brainstem can sort of decrease your stress and your grief. Chewing. Even they did a study with kids in school. Imagining that you're chewing gum can bring down your stress levels and your anxiety levels, and help you kind of focus and concentrate more. It really is a way to kind of think about what are the things that can calm your body down even if your mind isn't calm. There are some kind of tricks of the trade. Having the temperature cold in the room slows your breathing down and can make your body think it's more relaxed than it actually is. If you've ever seen on TV when people breathe into the bag, right? Having a way to visualize the way that your body is breathing or responding and reacting. And so some of those things are helpful, even if you're not there yet in your heart, and even if you're not there yet in your brain. And there's sort of this idea that if you can, I don't think you have to force yourself to do anything unless you need income, and then you probably got to force yourself to go to work or to get income. But there are ways in which you can train your body into being more okay than you are. And I think as long as you're not pretending you're okay with those you love and you have people who check in on you, there are ways in which you can still care for yourself and be present in the world. But it might be helpful to know, for example, that in the middle of grief, you can't see this side. You don't have peripheral vision. So you should look all the way when you're going to cross the street. And you might lose feeling in your fingertips when you're in grief. And so you might drop stuff a lot or bump into the door frame with your shoulder because you're not having the same spatial awareness. And you might lose track of things you normally could remember.
Short-term memory loss, absolutely.
Things down, right? And you might need, you might even stop hearing, even though people are talking. Or just have one of your senses at a time because your body is overwhelmed.
Absolutely.
So all of those things are normal and can happen for 2 months at a time without being something that's nervous making. And if it's after the 2 months mark and you haven't told anyone else, you might want to just tell a doctor or tell a therapist or tell someone else so that it's not getting so deeply ingrained that it gets tangled into, like when your shoelace gets in such a tight knot, you can't get it untied. But all of it's like grief can last forever. In varying degrees, right? And so knowing that it might come and go seasonally, have it in your calendar. Oh, this is the date that happened, so that if you're sad, you remember that there's a reason for it, and give yourself lots and lots of permission to feel whatever feeling happens. And maybe it happens in a pattern, and maybe it doesn't happen in a pattern, but it is kind of a sign of, I think, how much love we have for people that pass, that it can stick with us so deeply in our ribs. And so it can feel like it's in charge of us, but it also is sort of a blessing or an aftertaste of loving relationships and figuring out the new way you're going to be in relationship with that person, whether it's still talking to them as you walk around the house, or, every time you see a dragonfly, that there's a communication that's happening, or writing letters and mailing them to no one, right? Whatever is your ritual or your way of building a new relationship can help you continue that love and feel like you get to still share some of those parts of your life.
Absolutely.
Do you have thoughts about some of the things that might help people move into spaces where they're able to have new relationships with people who have passed?
So a couple of things to respond to kind of what you were sharing. It's always interesting to me how our bodies hold on to the grief and experience the grief, even when our mind is not aware of it. So very often I'll have somebody in grief counseling that will say to me, the other day I've been doing pretty well, and then the other day I just fell apart. I just started crying uncontrollably, and I don't know why. And they said, later in the day, I happened to look at the calendar, and I realized that it was the 6-month mark since my husband died, or since my brother died, or whatever it was. So cognitively, they were not even aware of the anniversary, but somehow their body knew that it was the anniversary, and their body responded to that anniversary. And so, it's not, grief is not just a cognitive thing, it's a whole body thing. And the other thing that I would say, death ends a person's life, but it doesn't end the relationship that you had with that person. That relationship lives on after the person has died. And a big part of the grief process is figuring out what that relationship is going to be going forward, what that's going to look like going forward, and who am I going to be going forward, and how am I going to hold my loved one who has died close to me in the days and weeks and months and years to come. And you're absolutely right, Bishop, that we never stop grieving. Again, my father died 20 years ago, and I'll be driving down the road somewhere, and a song will come on the radio that I connect with my dad, or that reminds me of my dad, and there it is, and I feel it, and I get sad, or I get tearful, or I get angry, or I get anxious, or whatever it is I feel, and it's there. It doesn't last for very long. It usually is only there for maybe 10, 15 minutes, maybe a half an hour, and then it kind of goes back into the background again. But it's always there. I am always going to miss my dad. As long as there is breath in my body, I am going to mourn the fact that my father is no longer physically a part of my life. But it changes. The way that the grief feels changes over time. I often tell people, they say, how long am I going to feel like this? How long am I going to struggle? How long am I going to cry every day because my loved one has died? And my answer to them is always, I don't know. I don't know how long it's going to take. But in time, it will change. It will develop. It will move into something else. It won't stay the same. It won't be as hard as it is today. That I can guarantee you.
Yeah, people will encounter it until the next thing happens, and we don't know what the next thing's going to be. The next thing might be a different feeling altogether, or it could be, you could unexpectedly be distracted by falling head over heels in love with someone. Who the heck knows, right? You could unexpectedly have another tragedy. You could unexpectedly win the lottery. Wouldn't that be the most surprising thing to happen, right? But it's one thing that I find particularly helpful about faith and congregational life is that we have built-in rhythms of talking about death into the church year cycle. And not everybody is a go-to-church kind of person. And thank God for chaplains, that's right. But for those of us who are in worship life and come upon rituals that are about death, are there ways that we dance into that more deeply, or just on tiptoes? And that, because I feel like there are all of these pastors are really good at overthinking liturgy, right? And wondering how deep should we go into Good Friday this year, or how deep should we go into talking about baptism as death in a year when death is palpable and grief is everywhere. And do you have any thoughts about sticking with those rhythms? I kind of like talking about death all the way on a regular basis because it allows people the openness to talk about it when there's a funeral, but it's not everybody's thing. Some people are feeling vulnerable and raw in a way that makes them try to figure out when they should bring it up and when they shouldn't. Do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, death is such loss, and death is such a part of our day-to-day life as human beings. And yet it is still something that, at least in our culture, it is something that we have difficulty talking about. We have difficulty acknowledging. We have difficulty acknowledging and speaking about. So I personally believe that we should talk about it more, because it's real. It's what we're really experiencing and what we're really dealing with on a day-to-day basis. But I know that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. I know that a lot of people, it's just overwhelming to them to think about it and to talk about it. And so it's easier not to. So I think it can be tricky. I think a pastor needs to know their congregation well enough to know kind of what is okay to talk about, and maybe what needs to be dealt with a little bit more carefully or a little bit more delicately. I like what you were saying about the rhythm of the church year, and how that can reflect so much of our human experience. I mean, one of my favorite liturgies of the entire year is the Easter Vigil every year, because it's just so full of ritual and symbol and meaning. From the fire, the warming fire that you start out with, to the darkness, to the water in baptism, to the Eucharist. There's just so much in there about life and about death and about the struggle that we often experience in life, and the presence of God in that struggle, and our faith. It's just a very meaningful liturgy that I find really touches me every year as we go through it.
Well, I was thinking as you were speaking about how, for those who are watching this at the same time that we're recording it and are going to hear all of the stories of the resurrection of Jesus in this season of Easter, to also listen within those stories about the joy of Jesus being alive, just the many ways that grief kind of shows itself, right? The not being able to see what's right in front of you, not necessarily noticing what's going on, and the need to eat way too many fish, right? And I think I also lift up from Jesus's story during this time of COVID. It's really struck with me how some of Jesus's most powerful and memorable sermons happened in the midst of his own personal grief, right? The Sermon of the Mount, all the blessed are they who are poor, right? All of those blesseds that Jesus proclaims happens right after he hears the news that his cousin died. And he tries to go off into the desert by himself, and these people follow him, and he just wants to be alone. And the disciples finally are sick of all of the people being there, and they say, they don't have any food, let's send them away. And Jesus has changed his heart and now wants them to stay, to be with him in the midst of all that he's sort of going through. And he's declaring, blessed are you, blessed are you. And to have had that way that grief changes, where, I don't know if you've had this moment, but you're sitting at a table after a funeral, and you're going through the cards and writing down the gifts so you can send the thank you notes later, and someone rings the doorbell and everyone goes, ugh, because they just don't want to talk to another visitor in the midst of the grief. And then they come in and they chat, and then after a while you sometimes feel like, man, I'm so glad that they came, and I wish that they would stay. And then all of a sudden the house is full, back in the day when you could do that, remember, right? And so there's something very human about traveling through grief Sometimes it brings us gifts of good insights. Other days it just makes us feel lonely in a crowd. Other days we just eat too much. But there is something beautiful about the way that Jesus is able to journey through that we as faith communities try to dance with the stories. And I think something really beautiful that you, in your call to serve God, feel called to sit with people going through some of the hardest moments of their life. And so I just want to make sure you know that I appreciate you and I'm proud of the work that you do. And I'm so grateful that in the midst of so much death, that there are people like you and all of the chaplains that we have who are serving in healthcare and in disaster work and in the military, and particularly those who are doing hospice ministry during this time. Like, what a sacred place to be. I'm just so grateful that you have followed this call.
One thing that I would share just in closing, because I know we're coming to the end here, as I often tell, it's interesting to me. People come to me for grief counseling because they think I have the answers, that I know what they need to do in order to grieve in a healthy way. And the reality is that I don't know. I don't know what you, Megan, or anybody else specifically needs to do to grieve. But I believe that you know, that deep down, you as an individual know what you need to do to grieve, just as Jesus knew what he needed to do to grieve. And so my job as a grief counselor is not to tell you what you need to do, but to help you discover what you already know you need to do, if that makes sense, is to help you trust your gut, trust your instinct, trust the spirit inside of you that's leading you. If you follow that little voice inside of you that says, this is what you need to do, if you follow that, it will never lead you wrong. It will never lead you astray. And so I would encourage everybody who's in the midst of the grief process, trust that voice inside of you that is leading you, that's trying to tell you what you need to do to grieve in a healthy way, because that little voice is going to guide you on the right path.
Well, I believe that what Jesus says, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. But even more so, I believe blessed are those who help with the comforting. And so thank you for this conversation. I believe we'll be having more conversations like this, and particularly about different chaplain skills and different chaplains in our synod. Yeah, thank you so much for your time today. I'm going to give you the last word if there's anything final you think we should say.
Yeah, I guess thank everybody for being here and for listening to this conversation, for giving me a chance to talk about what I love to do and what I feel called to do on a daily basis. And just again to acknowledge how hard this grief journey is, and how challenging it can be. But as I often say to my clients, with every challenge, there's also opportunity. So yes, you're struggling. Yes, this is a difficult obstacle that you're trying to cope with, you're trying to get over. But there's also, in the midst of that challenge, there are opportunities if you can see them and if you can grasp them. They are there as well. So be looking for those opportunities as well.
Thank you, Pastor Dale. Thank you, everyone who is watching. Take care, everybody.
Bye.